All right. Thank you, Peter. And thank you to all of you for spending your time with us this evening. We're going to get into a lot of, I hope, very interesting data in the voter file in Nevada and get into a lot of the opportunities that we are seeing at the Environmental Voter Project for you as volunteers and you as donors to make an impact in Nevada over the 6+ months. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I am the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And what we are going to be doing this evening is what you see on this screen. If you're like me, you like to know what's coming. So I want to tell you what's coming up. First, we're going to have a very quick intro to the Environmental Voter Project. I do understand that there are people on the line here, and there are many of you who are brand new to the Environmental Voter Project. And so I am going to give you a very, very brief overview of what we do, why we do it, how we do it, what our results are. But please just understand that it is going to be very brief. This is not meant to be an introduction webinar. If you would like an introduction webinar, Peter can put a link to one of those in the chat, and you can see a recording of that. But what we're going to try to do is get to the heart of today's discussion, which is item number 2 here. And that is an analysis of the environmental voters we've been able to identify in Nevada who are unlikely to vote this year, and the opportunities that they present for volunteers, for donors, and what their political impacts might be. And then, as Peter mentioned, we will have a Q&A session at the end. If you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to put them in the Q&A folder that most of you will see at the bottom of your screen. Peter might answer some of those as we go along, or he might hold them for the Q&A session at the end. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's our sole focus. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We do not endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate change or clean air or clean water or other environmental issues. In fact, a good way to think of us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we're trying to do is bypass the hardest, messiest stuff of politics, which is changing people's opinions, and instead finds the people who, for those of us in the climate movement, don't even need their minds or opinions changed at all. We try to identify people who care so deeply about climate or the environment that it's their number one priority over all other matters. Yet, they're not voting. And so what they need is a purely behavioral intervention. And as you can see from this map, there are a whole bunch of them. These are the 19 states that we work in, and obviously this evening we're going to be focused just on Nevada, but just to give you a sense of why we have this focus, well, in the 19 states that we're working in, we've already identified 4.8 million unique individual voters who we're targeting this year. So what does that mean? Well, they're all registered to vote. They're highly likely to list climate or some other environmental issue as their number one priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall. And we've made that determination because we've looked at their public voting histories, and essentially these are people who did not vote in the 2020 presidential election or any election since then. So yeah, finding these people who don't need their minds changed, they just need their behavior changed, is a really big opportunity. There is a huge, huge number of them. This is what we do with the Environmental Voter Project. And very briefly, we take a 4-step process. First, identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files. What this allows us to do is individually identify people who have a very high likelihood of not just caring about climate, but literally listing it as their number one priority. So we can individually tag these people on voter files who need these purely behavioral interventions. Remember, this is not an intro to EVP seminar, but if you would like more information about how we do this voter identification process, we can put a link in the chat for you. We have an 11-minute short video that just describes this identification process. But for now, just know that this is a highly accurate way for us to identify individual voters who just need to get pushed out the door on election day. Because we isolate these environment first people, we cross-reference their public voting histories, we get rid of the ones who are good voters, right? They don't need us. They don't need a behavioral intervention. And then we just focus on the ones who are unlikely to vote this year. That brings us to step 2, mobilization. Once we've identified these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote, we can now be completely agnostic with our messaging, right? We don't need to talk about climate change. We can just look at the entire field of behavioral economics and behavioral psychology and behavioral sociology and pick and choose messages that we know are really good at changing people's behavior. And again, we don't even need to talk about climate or the environment. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's the best way to get people to vote. And we've now run over 250 randomized control trials telling us which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to do one thing and one thing only, and that is start getting them to vote. We work with over 6,000 volunteers to call and canvass and postcard these voters. We also do digital ad and direct mail campaigns. And we're rolling into the next 6 months, having optimized all of our messaging after doing all of these, as I said, over 250 experiments, telling us exactly what to say to these voters. Step 3, habit reinforcement. Our ultimate goal is not to win one-off elections. Our ultimate goal is to dramatically increase the political power of the climate movement. And the way you do that is by not just getting a whole bunch of climate first people to show up to the polls in June or November of this year, but to get them to start consistently showing up whenever there's an election, not just for president, but all the way down to city council. Because we all know that important climate policy is made at the federal, state, and local level, but we also all know that politicians aren't necessarily going to lead on climate out of the goodness of their hearts. The only real way to get them to lead on climate is to force them to do that. And so in order to create that consistent block of climate voters, we take this third step, habit reinforcement, really seriously. We use every election as an opportunity to build good voting habits. And just as an example, this year, 2024, just since January 1st of this year, we have already been active in 151 different elections. 151. And I freely admit that not even a majority of those elections had much or anything to do with environmental policymaking at all. Most of them didn't. But they all had everything to do with changing people's behavior and changing their voting habits. Because what our philosophy is at the Environmental Voter Project is if you're in the business of improving people's voting habits, how dare you let an election pass you by without using it as an opportunity to talk to these voters? And so that's what we do. Because ultimately, as I alluded to earlier, our goal is to change the electorate. Our goal is to make such a huge population of consistent climate voters that politicians have no choice but to respond to them. Because at the end of the day, that is what really ends up moving policymaking. That is really what ends up moving policymaking. So let's move to this next thing. If you have further questions, oh, excuse me, we've got a little alarm here going in the background. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but hopefully that'll be taken care of soon. If you have questions about our work, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/about and find out more details. As far as our results, so over the past 4 years, we have had now probably over 900 elections where we have increased turnout among these low propensity climate voters. Now, we haven't been able to measure that and prove that we increased turnout in all of those elections because in many of them, it was a really, really small population of voters. But in a lot of them, the populations were big enough that we could measure what our sole impact was on climate while controlling for all outside variables. And again, if you have questions about this, we have a mini briefing, a video, and we can put a link in the chat that gets at how we measure our impact in particular elections and how we can be sure that we are solely responsible for increasing turnout in these elections. But just to give you a sense, over the last 4 years, we've increased turnout in 2020, 21, 22, and 23. We've increased turnout as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in statewide general elections. This is something we are enormously proud of, and we hope that all of our donors and volunteers are enormously proud of it as well. The second way that we measure our impact is over the long term. Since we launched a one city proof of concept now almost 9 years ago, we have now slowly expanded to the point where we're now active in 19 states. And over that time, every time we have communicated with a unique individual voter, all of whom by definition are super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote, right? Or else we wouldn't be talking to them. Well, every time we've done that, we've tagged them in the voter file. And as of just a few weeks ago, over 10.5 million low propensity environmental voters are people we have canvassed or called or mailed or sent digital ads to. And most of them, we've done it multiple times. These are 10.5 million unique voters. As of a few weeks ago, we saw in public voter files that over 1.8 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. Now, I want to be clear, this is different from our previous metric, the randomized control trial. We cannot claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. No other organization has now been active in close to 2,000 different elections over the past 9 years. This is the benefit of using all of these small elections to build up good, consistent voting habits. Again, forgive me for those of you who are brand new to the Environmental Voter Project. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail as to how we measure these things, but if you are interested, we have more information at environmentalvoter.org/results. And we also have some briefings, again, some of these mini video briefings on how we measure our impact and what some of our recent results are. So I encourage you to go to there. All right. Now we can get into the heart of what we wanted to discuss this evening, and that is the state of Nevada. As you all know, we've got a big election coming up in just a little bit more than 6 months, and boy, is Nevada going to be important. So let's dive into some of the data we have uncovered in Nevada. First off, these low propensity environmental voters that I were mentioning before, these people who we are targeting, we've identified almost 109,000 of them in Nevada. Now, again, I want to reiterate, these people are already registered to vote. They are already registered to vote. They are very likely to not just care about climate or the environment, but literally listed as their number one priority over all other issues. Yet, they are unlikely to vote this fall. And we've made that determination because they didn't vote in the last presidential election or any election since then. We think these are the people who need this purely behavioral intervention of ours that we know from randomized control trials can really boost turnout. All right. What does that mean, right? Like, what does 109,000 mean? Well, in a state like Nevada, only 1.4 million ballots were cast last time there was a presidential election. So we're talking about our target population at the Environmental Voter Project this year being so big that it approaches 9% of all ballots that were cast last time there was an election. This is a huge, huge opportunity for the climate movement. There are a lot of non-voting and infrequently voting climate-first registered voters in Nevada. And then if you look back at what the margin was in 2020, Biden only won Nevada by 33,000 votes. It's a very, very close state. And as we look at the next 6 months that are coming up, the whole world's eyes are going to be looking at Nevada. Now, obviously, there will be other important states as well. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. But let's just take a second to think about Nevada here. First, it will be really tight for who wins the White House. Second, there is a really, really tight Senate race. Democrat Jackie Rosen has, a lot of people running for in the Republican primary, 3 significant candidates. The primary is coming up in about 6 weeks, and we'll see who her opponent is. But it's going to be super tight, and it will likely be one of 3 or 4 Senate races that determines which party controls the U.S. Senate. Moreover, Nevada only has 4 congressional seats, yet 3 of them are super competitive. 3 of them are listed as competitive seats currently by the Cook Political Report, and they only have 30 or 35 seats listed. So 3 out of Nevada's 4 congressional seats are going to be competitive. So not only will Nevada likely be one of a handful of states that determines who's in the White House, it also could determine who controls the U.S. Senate. It also could determine which party controls the House of Representatives. Then, on top of that, there's an open Las Vegas mayoral election. The preliminary election is happening in July. If nobody gets 50% of the vote, that moves on to November. And there could be a whole bunch of important ballot questions in Nevada on legalizing abortion, on starting ranked choice voting, on whether they'll be requiring more stringent voter ID, a whole bunch of important ballot questions. Nevada, I mean, the way I like to think of it is almost every voter who walks into the polling place this November and pulls a ballot or gets their ballot that when it's mailed to them at home, they're going to look at that ballot and at least 3 or 4 things that they're voting on will be crucially important. Crucially important. So as we look ahead this year, Obviously, November 5th is really, really important. But June 11th is also an important date. June 11th is the state primary. It's an opportunity for us to communicate with all of these voters, but it also is that Las Vegas mayoral election. Now, enough people are running for this seat that I'd say it's likely that it will move on to November 5th. It's likely that no candidate will get 50% plus one of the vote, but who knows? But June 11th is going to be a big deal. It's going to be a big deal. The final thing I'll just mention before we start getting into the demographics of these low propensity environmental voters we've identified in Nevada is this. Nevada is, if not the newest, one of the newest states that now mails ballots to all active registered voters. So they started experimenting with this in COVID. They kept it in 22 and 23, and it's still going. And so every single active registered voter is going to have a ballot show up at their house at least 20 days before Election Day. Different counties are going to mail them out at different times. And I bring this up because, one, a lot of voters aren't used to this yet, or at least a lot of voters who are likely to vote for president aren't used to this yet. Two, it creates an additional opportunity for those of us in the voter turnout business to communicate with voters prior to their ballot showing up. So it's almost like this is a second election day, right? Like your ballot's about to arrive, don't throw it out. And then we can start communicating with them during all of those days that follow, knowing that their ballot is either there in their house, or we find out that they've thrown it out and we can start helping them vote in a different way. This is a really, really valuable opportunity in Nevada. So it's something that, again, not only is this going to be a really important state, but these new voting opportunities open up new voter turnout opportunities. All right, now let's start talking a little bit about who these low propensity environmental voters are. I'd like you to look at the very bottom row of data here. You'll see it says reg voters. What that is that's the demographic makeup of all registered voters in Nevada. So the way to read this chart is right here, 10.0. What that means is 10% of registered voters in Nevada are age 18 to 24. Go over here, 19.1% of them are 25 to 34. And so you can go all along that row of registered voters and see the age breakdown, sex breakdown, and race breakdown of what the underlying electorate is. We think that's important to provide to you so that you can have some context when we go through this next line, the second to last line. This is our targets, the LPEVs, or low propensity environmental voters. And so when we tell you what their demographic makeup is, you have something to compare it to. So the first thing that pops out, probably comes as no surprise to all of you, is, whoa, are these low propensity environmental voters disproportionately young, right? Over 45% of them are 18 to 24. Whereas at the overall electorate in Nevada, only 10% of them are 18 to 24. So this is a really young population of voters that we're targeting. If you take an even bigger group of young people, so everybody 18 to 34, they make up what, 70, 83, almost 84% of our target population. Whereas in the underlying electorate, they're less than 30%. So this is very young. That being said, I will say this is not terribly different from what we see in most other states. In fact, I'd say this is kind of typical for what we see in other states. Usually we see that about 80 to 85% of our target population is below the age of 35. The second thing that I'll point out is you'll see it's not as simple as the older you get, the less likely you are to care about climate. No, we don't see that. we pretty consistently in all of our states see that the percentage of climate voters bottoms out in this 50 to 64 age range and then starts going up. Now, to be clear, here we're obviously looking at low propensity climate voters, low propensity environmental voters. But if we got rid of vote propensity as a factor, this number of 65 and older people who prioritize climate would be even higher. So that's another thing I just want to stress to all of you, because there's this misconception out there that the climate movement and people who care deeply about climate is pretty much just young people, and that's not what we see. Certainly, young people are the largest age group of people who care about climate. But in many states, not in Nevada, but in many states, people 65 and up are the second largest group. All right. If we look at the sex data, it's not as helpful in Nevada. There isn't a lot of public data that's made available on public voter files about people's sex. And so that has to be gotten from other publicly available sources. And so you'll see there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of unknown data. And so that's why you'll notice that. Finally, when we look at the racial breakdown, well, you'll see that Nevada is a predominantly white state. 64% of registered voters are white, 20% are Hispanic. But when you look at our target population, when you look at low propensity environmental voters, it's far more disproportionately made up of people of color. So far fewer white people, yet Asian American and Pacific Islanders and Black voters are far more represented in our target population. What we don't see is that Hispanic voters are much more represented in our target population. You'll see they're a little bit more represented in our target population, but only a little bit. And that's a recent change. If I had been going through our data with you a year and a half or 2 years ago, people who list climate and the environment would have been more disproportionately Hispanic. But that's changing in Nevada. And it's changing in some other states. It's changing a lot in Florida, a little bit less so in Texas, where Hispanic men in particular are less likely to prioritize progressive issues, and certainly climate is among them. The predominance of Black voters and AAPI voters, that is something that we see pretty consistently in all of our other states. And so that is a trend that is not unique to Nevada. All right, moving forward. In the congressional districts that we see, you'll note we've got 4 congressional districts in Nevada. This top one, the second, is not terribly competitive. Not terribly competitive at all. It's R+8. What R+8 means is that all else being equal across the United States, when you take an average of the last 4 federal elections, so the last 2 midterms and the last 2 presidentials, this district, voters in this district, vote 8 points more Republican than the national average. So this is not a landslide red district by any means. There are plenty of states that are really aggressively gerrymandered, and you see, R+30 or D+30 districts. That's not this, but this is unlikely to be a terribly competitive district. The other districts, however, they are likely to be pretty competitive. So you've got the 3rd district down here, and you've got the 1st and the 4th districts. Very, very competitive. You'll see D+3, D+1, and D+3. You'll also note the number of targets we have in each of those congressional districts. In the 1st, a very tight district, we have individually identified over 27,000 of these targets, these low propensity environmental voters. In the third district, so the one that is most competitive, and don't worry, I'm going to zero in on some maps and get into more detail here in a little bit. But there, we've identified almost 29,000 of these low propensity environmental voters. And then you'll see in the fourth up here, almost 26,000. All right, let's take a look at what those look like. This is what the entire state looks like with a distribution of our targets. As a reminder, we have almost 109,000 targets. Obviously, this is not 109,000 dots that you're seeing on the map. This is a random assortment just to give you an idea of their distribution across the state. But they're distributed kind of like the population of Nevada is distributed, and that is really heavily in urban areas. All right. When we look at the closest, the most competitive congressional district, and that is the first, I'm sorry, that is the third, excuse me, over here, that's the D+1 district. Look at how tightly packed that target population is. This is not just interesting to look at. It's important because of all of these municipal elections that are coming up in June. We are going to have really good opportunities to talk to these voters, not just in November, but before November, and not in snooze fest elections, but in elections that matter because they are in part of Las Vegas, but also part of some of these cities right outside of Las Vegas. A great opportunity to talk to these people. You'll notice that in the 4th congressional district, it's very different. Very, very different. This is this district here, a bit more spread out. And then finally, in the 1st congressional district, that is sort of the furthest southeast, again, part of Las Vegas, but then curving around here. Again, really, really densely packed in. And so we're going to be able to take advantage of some of these June 11th municipal elections to start communicating with these voters and turning them into better, more habitual voters. All right. There are also state elections going on this year. Many of you may remember the gubernatorial election 2 years ago was extraordinarily close. A Republican won. The U.S. Senate election 2 years ago was extraordinarily close. A Democrat won. The state Senate and state assembly elections were pretty darn close. But after those close elections, we were left with Democratic control of both chambers. The Senate is a little bit closer than the state assembly. All of the state assembly seats are up for re-election this fall. Only half, or 10 out of 21, of the state Senate seats are up for election. It is possible that control of the state Senate could flip. From what we can tell currently, it is not likely. But again, this brings us back to what I was saying earlier. So many Nevadans, an overwhelming majority of Nevadans, are going to look at their ballots this October and this November, and they, up and down the ballot, are going to have opportunities to vote in crucially important elections. Congress, Senate, President, all three of which could be decisive. But also, many of these state ledge races are going to be decisive as well. And so I really want to impress upon you the importance of Nevada this cycle. Now, as a reminder, we are targeting a little bit fewer than 109,000 voters. Our budget for Nevada just for the next 6 months is $430,000. That's a pretty robust spend when you're only targeting 109,000 people. 109,000 people is like 1/6 the size of a congressional district. So this would be like a congressional campaign spending $3.5 million in the last 6 months of their race. It's a pretty robust campaign. We aren't going to save it all for October, though. And here's why. I've brought up a few times now the opportunities that are coming up in June. This June 11th state primary is not only an opportunity to get people used to voting by mail, but it's also some really important municipal elections. And so we've got, I think, over 600 volunteers who are writing postcards as we speak to mail to these low propensity environmental voters for the June 11th state primary. We will also be running robust volunteer phone campaigns for the June 11th election, and also be running digital ad campaigns for the June 11th election. Then this fall, we are going to be doing robust phones, digital ads, and direct mail from September through November. We are going to go big in Nevada. But one way in which we are different, well, there are a whole lot of ways in which we're different from other groups, but one big way is we recognize the importance of June. You cannot sleep on this June election opportunity. It's going to be a really cheap, largely static-free way to communicate with these low propensity environmental voters before October and November, where things get really messy and really staticky and really expensive. So, you are here for a reason this evening. You are here because you care deeply about the climate crisis, or you care deeply about the democracy crisis, or you're really nerdy and just like hearing about election data and voter data, or all three of those things put together. But regardless of which of those apply to you, please understand the opportunity that Nevada provides to the Environmental Voter Project and to all of you. And I'm going to ask you to donate to support our voter turnout work in Nevada. Here is the link. We'll put it in the chat. Any donations that are made through that link will be earmarked for Nevada. We will not spend them anywhere else. All donations help, donations of any size. Just in April, just this month, we've already gotten over 1,030 different donations. Boy, are we lucky to have so many generous, wonderful donors. But those donations, big and small, really, really add up. So please be a part of it. And yes, big donations are also welcome. There is no limit on the amount you can donate. No limit at all. If you would like to wire us funds or make a stock donation, let us know. We can provide that information for you. Just email us at info@environmentalvoter.org, and we will. The second thing you can do is make your donation a recurring monthly donation. This is helpful for a few reasons. Obviously, a lot of you would like to give more than you might be able to. But if you spread it out over multiple months, it's easier for your budget. The second reason it's helpful is we need to be able to budget too. We need to know, okay, how much can we afford to spend in this upcoming important June 11th election opportunity, yet still have a good idea of what our cash flow will be in September and October and November. We now have over 600 recurring monthly donors, and boy, would we like to get that number up even higher. It helps us plan ahead and take advantage of these early opportunities without robbing Peter to pay Paul, without taking away our ability to also make an impact later on in the year. And then finally, if you would like to host an online event like this over Zoom, boy, do I love meeting with groups of 10, 15, 20 people, present to them what the Environmental Voter Project does. It won't just focus on Nevada unless that's what you'd like. We'll go into more detail on how we identify and mobilize these voters, more in detail on some of our results. And then we'll pitch people and ask them to donate to support our work. And if they want to, great. And if they don't, that's fine too. But boy, do we like the opportunity to talk to people. So for all of these things, visit the links in the chat, make a donation, whether it's one time or monthly. If you're interested in learning more about hosting your own event, please email us either at info@environmentalvoter.org or nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. And now I am really, really excited to find out what your questions are. Again, I apologize for earlier this evening for that interruption, the alarm there in the background, but hopefully you were able to hear enough that you've got a lot of great questions for us. And I am really, really excited to find out what they are. So Peter, what do we got?
Thanks, Nathaniel. And at least from my end, I heard no alarm.
Oh, great.
So I think you were good to go.
There was a fire alarm in the background, but everybody is safe. I was just a little distracted, but I'm glad you all couldn't hear it.
Okay, we all feel it in our own way, right?
That's
These
right.
days.
It's just
Um,
anxiety.
so there are a few questions that I'd love to toss your way, Nathaniel. The first is from Mike. There's a lot of apathy among voters about the choices for president. While your messaging has been effective in past elections, is there a risk that this year's EVP efforts will not have the same impact as in previous elections?
Great question, Mike. Yeah, yeah, there's a risk. I'm not going to claim that I know what's going to happen. I think anybody who tells you that they do is pulling the wool over your eyes. Part of the reason why we test over and over and over again is because we never want to presume that something that was true a year ago or 2 years ago remains true. Now, obviously, we can't predict how our messaging will land this fall. We can't. But what I can say is we're not resting on our laurels, Mike. We're not throwing out messaging that was impactful 4 years ago or 5 years ago. We always refresh this stuff. In fact, as an example of that, last September, we did a webinar of our recent successful messaging experiments. And then just 2 weeks ago, we had so many new successful messaging experiments that we did another webinar. And maybe Peter can put one or both of them in the chat so you can have links to them. But that shows you not just the rapidity with which we're running these tests, but also how quickly we get successful results that are worth sharing. So that's just some background. So no, I cannot guarantee that the messaging that has worked recently will work again this fall. However, Mike, I do think that I can put you a little bit at ease because I understand the impetus to your question. Of course, you're right that a lot of people are feeling really apathetic. And a lot of people are frustrated. And boy, do we live in like a scary, anxious time. I mean, I think if a pollster walked up to someone on the street and asked them if they liked ice cream, most people would say no. like people are angry now. They don't like anything. But one of the many unique things about our messaging, Mike, is that it does not rely on trying to convince people to vote because of how much they care about climate or because of the impact that their vote can have. Nor are we a political campaign that's trying to convince people to vote because they care about candidate X or candidate Y. Instead, the conceptual underpinning of all of our messaging relies on social cues and social desires. We're not trying to rationally convince people of the importance of voting. We were doing that. growing apathy might really hurt the impact of our messaging. Instead, what we're doing is we are treating people as social animals and using things like peer pressure or FOMO, fear of missing out. We've got a lot of messaging that's like, everybody in your state is voting more and more each year. Oh my God, you're going to be the last person left in Texas who doesn't vote. You've got to vote. Things like that take advantage of these social norms and how they can change people's behavior. And that is much less likely to be impacted by voter apathy. And so, just to reiterate, no, of course, I can't guarantee that what has proven successful for us in the past will always prove successful in the future. But we refresh our research all the time. And because of the nature of our messaging, I think it is less likely to be impacted by voter apathy than, say, campaign messaging would, or messaging that relies on trying to rationally convince people of the importance of their vote, which is something we don't do. But it's a really, really good question, and I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds, Mike.
Thank you. So Carol, a little while ago, asked us to please share an example of how messages vary for different subsets of the target population. And if I can add on to that, a common question that we get from folks, Nathaniel, could you touch on the modes of contact that we use and what might be considered the best or why we have these modes of contact?
Okay, great question, Carol, and great question about the modes of contact. All right. So we communicate with voters in ways that can be individually delivered. Because remember, we are targeting individual voters, not broad demographic groups, but individual voters. Obviously, a billboard can't be individually targeted, or radio ads, or by and large, TV ads, although that's changing a bit in certain contexts. The things that can be individually delivered are the ways that we communicate with voters. So, phone calls, door-to-door canvassing, and postcards. Those are the three things that volunteers help us with. And then as a staff, we also run direct mail and digital ad campaigns. So those are the 5 modes of contact that we have with our target voters. As far as which ones are the most successful, I think the question was, and then Carol, I'll get to your question about sort of messages that work better with different subgroups. The way we think about this is along 2 axes. One is the effectiveness of messages, and the second is the efficiency of messages. Because you can imagine there are some messages that have a really high ceiling, right? Their ability to increase turnout can go really, really high, but maybe they're really expensive. Or maybe it is something like, say, door-to-door canvassing. Well, I mean, this is a perfect example. Door-to-door canvassing is still the single most effective form of voter contact. It doesn't always boost turnout the most, but it has the ability to boost turnout the most. There have been instances where we boosted turnout almost 6 percentage points over our control group just from door-to-door canvassing. So it has the ability to be the most effective, but it's not always that efficient, right? I mean, even if you're in a really dense turf, a really dense group of target voters, maybe in a 2-hour shift, a volunteer can knock on 50 doors. Maybe if it's a weekday evening, at best 20% of your people will be home. You know, that's not terribly efficient. That's not always an efficient use of volunteer time. Other things are inefficient because of cost. So those are the 2 axes on which we view these things. The most effective, door-to-door canvassing. After that, direct mail and digital ads. The most efficient, volunteer phone calls. Fairly cheap, high contact rate. But what I want to be clear about, the most important thing is not for you to say, oh, okay, well, Nathaniel said this, so we should only door-to-door canvass, or we should only make phone calls. No, no. What almost every experiment I have ever seen says is that these interventions are additive, by which I mean when you layer them on top of each other, you don't lose a whole lot of efficiency or effectiveness. And so you always want to try to do a combination of all of those things. You want to canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to voters and send volunteer postcards to them for a few reasons. One, that impact is additive. Two, there are a whole bunch of people you can't contact in particular ways. There are many Native Americans who live on reservations where they do not have postal addresses. You simply can't mail them. There are some people who live in high rises or gated communities, and you're never going to be able to canvass them. There are some people who don't supply their phone numbers when they register to vote, and so you can't call them. And so that's another reason why it's really important to have a multiplicity of modes in which you contact people. And then finally, the third way, and don't worry, Carol, I'm not forgetting your question. The third reason why it's important to have these multiple forms of contact, it's kind of, embarrassing to admit this, but the truth is, no matter how clever we are, our best messaging still isn't as good as repetition. Obviously, the best case scenario is if we are both clever and able to repeat our messaging. That's what we would really love to be able to do. But donors and volunteers often worry, forgive me, a little bit too much about repetition. And I totally understand this. I've run a whole bunch of campaigns before. I have been a volunteer and donor myself before, and I get it. Part of what you think is like, oh, well, I think that group's going to be doing this. So I should find a group that does that and make sure that there is an overlap. Like, no. Overlap is not a bad thing. Oh my God, is it hard to get in to people's brains and compete with all of the other messages that are out there, not just political messages, but ads for sneakers and everything else that's trying to vie for their attention. And if you can have multiple messages over multiple modes of contact reaching these voters, even from multiple messengers, that is not a bad thing. That is not a bad thing. Okay. To get to Carol's question about an example of a particular message that performs really well with one group of people, but not others. Just recently, we had a message that was based on a psychological concept known as divestiture aversion. Sometimes it's called the endowment effect. Peter, if you're able to find the link to this was the heads up mail experiment, and maybe Peter can put a link to the report in the chat so you can see it, Carol. What this was it's funny, I wasn't even thinking of this. We had Nevada on our minds. And so last fall, we wanted to run an experiment in Colorado because Colorado is another state that mails ballots to people, to all active registered voters. And we wanted to start getting really smart about whether there are ways to message to people who were going to get their ballots in the mail. And so in Colorado, we ran an experiment where we sent just one mail piece that was supposed to arrive before people got their ballots in the mail to make it less likely that they would ignore or even throw out that ballot. And the messaging that we used takes advantage of this behavioral psychology concept known as the endowment effect or divestiture aversion. Pretty much what we were saying is, you are a voter. You have this thing of value. You have earned the right to vote. So don't lose it. Don't ruin it. Don't screw it up by throwing out your ballot before you even have a chance to vote. It was a very simple mail piece and had a picture of like a waste paper basket with a ballot sitting at the bottom and in big block bold letters that said, don't throw away your vote. It was very impactful. If I remember correctly, it was just one postcard that we sent, one postcard that increased turnout, I think 0.5 percentage points over our control group. But Carol, to your question, when Peter, our data director, who's here today, dug deeper into the data, he realized almost all of that increase in turnout came from women. And if we just looked at men, there actually wasn't a statistically significant increase in turnout at all. At all. This gets to that efficiency thing that I was talking about before. We could have spent half as much money by just sending that postcard to women and not men, and we probably could have created just as many new voters. Because it turns out that message, at least in this one experiment, didn't work with men. So there's an example, Carol. We've got a whole bunch of examples like that, and I encourage you to go to our results page and you can see a lot of our studies, but that's one example. That's one example. All right, I think we've got time for one more question, Peter, if there is one.
Can you go into at least some detail in the remaining 3 minutes here about why mobilizing people for this summer's election, and not just statewide, but specific to also Las Vegas, is so important, and why we're not just focusing everything on November 5th?
Yes, thank you. And this gets back a little bit to Mike's really good question earlier. We're so conditioned. We're all children of the Enlightenment, and we're conditioned to think of all behavior, but especially voting, as like the outcome of a rational decision-making process, right? And it's just not the case. Behavioral scientists tell us that the decision whether to vote or whether to exercise or whether to eat healthy, a whole lot of these decisions we make throughout our daily routine are often based on social desires to try to project a personality or to try to fit in a certain way or things like that. And perhaps more importantly, they can become habitual. They can become habitual. So the reason this June 11th election is an important opportunity, well, there are a few reasons. First, it is not a completely different decision-making process as this November will be. If we can get people to think of this election and consider whether they're going to vote or not, and then, we get them to vote, they are then much, much more likely to show up again this fall, because we know that voting can be a potentially habitual behavior. The second reason why June is so important is to, again, teach infrequent voters that there is this fairly new way that they are going to be able to vote. And that is that they are going to be getting a ballot delivered to their home. And boy, is it important for people to understand that. And then the third and final thing I'll mention is the public nature of the voter file. My guess is a few of you are chuckling hearing me say that. I never, ever get through any presentation without talking about the importance of people's voting histories being public record. For those of you who don't know this, let me just reiterate. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. And so if we can get even 50, even 25 of these low propensity climate voters to vote for the first time in this June 11th mayoral election in Las Vegas or elsewhere in the state primary, it only takes a few months for the record of them having voted to then show up on public voter files. And then it's like a bright red beacon is next to their name, telling everybody who's running for Senate or president or Congress this fall that they are a brand new voter. And then it's like we have pushed them into the pipeline of people who politicians actually pay attention to. And so this is a crucial opportunity, a crucial opportunity. All right, we're 1 minute over. I'm going to end there by just saying this. First, thank you for spending your time with us this evening. The Environmental Voter Project is extraordinarily proud of the fact that we have donors and volunteers and friends who really want to learn about important opportunities like this and how we can go about mobilizing these first-time voters. The second thing that I will just say is that there is a donation link in the chat. I'm not asking for your charity. I'm not asking for a favor. I am asking for you to do a favor for yourselves. You are here because you recognize the crucial importance of the next 6 months and Nevada in particular. So please take a moment now to invest in those values that you care deeply about and invest in voter turnout over the next 6 months. Click on the link so that it's open. Make a donation tonight. Please be generous. We will report back to you on the results. And if you'd like to make it a recurring monthly donation, that would be wonderful. So thank you for your time tonight. Please email us with questions. And thank you, Peter, for helping run the show this evening. Take care, everybody.